So now our next speaker is Eleanor Hines. She's going to talk about the unique role and place of Cherry Point in the Salish Sea. Eleanor is the North Sound Baykeeper and the lead scientist at Resources for Sustainable Communities. She earned her BS and MS in environmental toxicology from Huxley College at Western Washington University, and has continued to volunteer with the Surfrider Foundation and Waka Marine Resources Committee. She's worked at Nooksack Salmon Enhancement Association, Garden of the Salish Sea, and Institute of Natural Resources in South Africa. That was before she joined Resources. At Resources, among her many duties, she's also a great part of the Cherry Point Committee. So, Eleanor Hines. Thanks, Eleanor.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today. I appreciate, especially on a really sunny day like today, on a Saturday, that you guys are all here. So thank you. So I'm going to talk about Cherry Point's unique role in the Salish Sea. Cherry Point, so unique means one of a kind, and Cherry Point really is one of a kind. One of a kind is one of a kind, but I feel like it's just so extremely one of a kind compared to a lot of other places. You can't really compare it to anywhere else. There's no place that's really all that similar to it. So today I'm hoping to give you guys a better idea of what Cherry Point is. In the past, we've had some feedback from this forum that some people haven't been to Cherry Point. They don't know what's there, what it has to offer. So I'm going to go through some of the stuff that we work on, other folks are working on out there, and some of the really great highlights on what actually makes it unique. So I guess for starters, I'd like to start out with, who here has actually been to Cherry Point? Okay, good number of you. What are some of your favorite places out there? Feel free to just shout it out. All of them. All of them. Perfect. The salt marsh, okay, great. Anything else? Yeah, Point Whitehorn, yeah. Yeah, riparian area. Great. Okay. So I work for Resources. They have a number of different programs that I encourage you to check out if you're interested. And I am your North Sound Baykeeper. And so we work for fishable, swimmable, drinkable water, among other things. And my goal today is to talk about how we can really tie together policy and science, hopefully. This is a mouthful, but as Bertie mentioned earlier, Resources houses staff support for the Cherry Point Aquatic Reserve Citizen Stewardship Committee, and we have an AmeriCorps, Lilia, that you'll meet later, who really helps to enable them to do the things that they want to do to be good stewards and spread education and outreach. So for example, one of the early on things that the group decided was, hey, there aren't any signs that label it as Cherry Point Aquatic Reserve. No wonder, but no one knows that it is Aquatic Reserve. Maybe we should start with putting some signs out there and label it Cherry Point Aquatic Reserve. And so that's at Gulf Road, if you aren't familiar with that area. And I believe that is a Puget Sound Corps member also helping to install the sign. So to give you a sense of where Cherry Point is, we're in the Salish Sea, and Cherry Point is right smack in the middle there. And so there are 3 piers out there, which means it receives ships, which have to navigate these waters to get in and out, which combined with all the other traffic that's out there, that can add up. So anytime there's a proposal that might increase vessel traffic, it really plays into the bigger picture of what else is going on in the Salish Sea, because every time we add another ship, we're adding to all of the traffic that's out there, and then potentially increasing risks for things like vessel collisions and oil spills and other stuff like that, as well as impacting maybe whale migration and other stuff like that. And the other thing that I like about this map too is that, Cherry Point's kind of right smack in the middle there. It's really an interesting area to be So getting a little closer, these are the 8 different aquatic reserves. We're up there at the top. Zooming in a little bit closer, Cherry Point's up here. It doesn't really, when I first moved here, I was like, first time I went to Cherry Point, I was like, I think it was Point Whitehorn, and it just looked like a straight stretch of beach. And I was like, how is this a point? And then zooming out onto a map, really, like Point Whitehorn is more of the point. But Cherry Point Aquatic Reserve really encompasses a lot of that area. So it's north of Bellingham, just a little south of the border. And it's interesting, like it's such an interesting place. Earlier this summer, we were out trying to do kelp surveys on this end, and we couldn't do them because the wave action was just so intense that we weren't able to launch our boats from the beach out at Gulf Road. And then we had to go around the corner up here. We were thinking about canceling it and maybe redoing it at some other point, but we decided to just go check it out to put in the, or swap out the ocean acidification sensors, and it was totally calm over there. So this area can get a lot of wave action, and things get really interesting around that corner there. While I'm on this map too, so we do kelp surveys like I mentioned, and you can see there's this shallower area out here called Alden Bank, where there's also some bull kelp beds too, and so those are also surveyed. But it's just such an interesting area where you have such a long stretch and different currents all mixing in that area. So this is an even closer up of the area. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but I took this from the North Cascades Audubon site. And so there's Birch Bay State Park up here, which is publicly accessible. And then there's this swath here. This is around where that OA site I was talking about. And then you have Point Whitehorn here. And you can see Point Whitehorn Park in this area. I think this is, yeah. And then there's some residential area up there. And then you have the 3 piers and the refineries and industry down that way. Just to give you a sense of what the land use is abutting that area. So down here it is industrially zoned, which makes for an interesting landscape. They're all more or less set back directly from the water, whereas if you've ever kayaked that area, it looks way different along here, and then as you get further down here than it does along this area, because you don't have houses that are right up to the edge, but there's lots of other things going on there too. So getting a little bit into the history of the area, the Semiahmoo and Lummi have traditionally called Cherry Point their home over the years. The area was first populated by only about 9 people. Initially, it was mostly Scandinavians. It started growing up to 100 people around the Point Whitehorn area. They were mostly farmers and loggers, a lot of dairy farms and lumber and shingle mills is what brought in the money for people of that area. One of the reasons why it wasn't so populated is that the roads to get there weren't very easy, or they were just trails or single wagon tracks. And so it took a long time to build a home out there because it just took a while to get out there. So to get supplies, many folks had to walk 14 miles round trip to either Custer or even longer to get to and from Blaine. And the reason why I'm going over this is because I think a lot of times I go out there and I see what it looks like today and forget how it sort of developed over the years. Another interesting piece of history was that there was a fish camp out there. They had about 10 fish traps set up out there, and Pacific American Fisheries is who hosted the fish camp, and they leased the land out there. And this was around the late 1920s, early 1930s. Because there was nowhere to process the fish out there, they were quickly taken into the city of Bellingham, Fairhaven area, where they were processed at the Pacific American Fisheries cannery in the Bellingham area. And then It didn't last too long, though, because in 1934 there was a citizens' initiative passed that outlawed fish traps, so that put an end to the camp after that. Then moving along into industry and when it got there, and just a little bit on who populated that area. So 1954, General Petroleum completed its mobile refinery, which today is where ConocoPhillips is, and so that's the furthest south one. And then in 1966, Intalico built their aluminum smelter, and so they, I believe, still are currently the largest aluminum smelter, at least in the US. And they share a pier with petroleum gas, too. And then in 1971, Arco Refinery they bought up the last homes in the area and built their refinery, and it started operation in 1971, which is now where BP is. And that's sort of the furthest north one. Another piece of that abuts the Aquatic Reserve is the Point Whitehorn Marine Reserve. 54 acres were acquired by the Whatcom Land Trust, who then transferred it over to the Whatcom Parks and Recreation. And it's a beautiful park. I definitely recommend getting out there when you can. There's about 3/4 of a mile trail that you can walk along. And when you get to the end of or almost the end of the trail, there's a great lookout, and there's a beautiful interpretive sign that the Citizen Stewardship Committee and DNR helped to install. And then there's a whole bunch of stairs down to the beach. And that's where we do intertidal surveys. We also will be doing sea star wasting syndrome surveys out there. And in the wintertime, it'll be, I think, it'll be either in December or January. And it'll be at nighttime, so it's a great time to get out there when you get to see all kinds of intertidal organisms that you don't actually get to see sometimes during the same low tides during the summertime, because they're not all hiding from the sun and people checking them out. So it's a really great experience that I encourage you, any one of you could sign up for. Can you tell me that one again? Sure. During the winter? So we do it during the winter and we do it during the summer. For the sea star wasting. So during the summertime, we do it during daytime because low tides are during the day, and then during the winter, we do it at night, only because the tides are typically low at night. Yeah. I mean, yes, but in the winter, typically not, but that would be neat to check out. I have seen bioluminescence in January before. It's not common, but it does happen if we get a long stretch of beautiful sunny days. But yeah, we do it because the tides. But it also turns out to be a really great experience, too. So how do we find out about it? If you signed up on the email list out there, you should find out about it. So then as all of this happened through the years, DNR started establishing aquatic reserves, and Cherry Point was identified as one area, and so that started this whole stakeholder process. I was not part of that process, and I'm sure there are some folks in this room who could tell some really great stories about this, about the whole stakeholder formation and how the management plan was formed. And out of that also came the Citizen Stewardship Committee too, because it was recognized that this management plan was created, but a local group to really make sure that the management plan was being followed and would be able to get out and make decisions like, hey, let's do sea star wasting syndrome surveys out there, or let's do bird surveys, or let's do intertidal surveys, and let's host a science forum, or let's host What's the Point, and get people out on the beach. The Aquatic Reserve was designated in 2010. There's 3,050 acres of state-owned aquatic lands, and then there was a boundary update in 2017. So initially, the Aquatic Reserve, as I'm sure many of you know, there was another cutout around that area because at the time, there was supposed to be potentially a fourth export terminal built. And it was unknown where it was in the process. So in the management plan, they just left the cutout, assuming that maybe it's going to be there someday. Then, I believe it was June 2016, 2017, really recently, the Lummi Nation asked the Army Corps of Engineers, hey, can you deny this project because it would really significantly impact our usual and accustomed fishing grounds, and then also listed a whole bunch of other things. And so Army Corps of Engineers took that request and really analyzed it, and in the end decided, no, we can't build this. It would have too significant of an impact on Lummi's tribal treaty rights. And so right from the beginning, back in, I think, 2012 or so, Lummi Nation said, hey, we can't be bought. We don't agree with this project. And so it was a long battle, but, or relatively, I guess, speaking, because if you think about it, this proposal goes back earlier to at least the 1990s. So once that project was denied, DNR went through a process with the technical advisory committee to change the boundary to actually include that fourth cutout that looks like it's going to remain vacant. It just makes sense to include it. So I'm going to go into some of the significant species that are out there. So some of you already brought up, or it was the Cherry Point herring were already brought up. Forage fish are extremely important for a variety of species. They eat plankton, and then beyond that, everything kind of eats them or relies on something that eats them. So they're extremely important for all of the Salish Sea, not just here. And the thing that's really interesting about the Cherry Point herring is that they tend to spawn later than any of the other herring in our area. And so there are different thoughts out there. Some people think, oh, this might mean that they're going to be more impacted by things like climate change because they're all getting cooked when they spawn. Or some people think they're actually more, they're a little bit hardier because they're used to spawning a little bit later to higher temperatures. So if they were able to figure out, hey, we need to spawn a little bit earlier, maybe they'd be able to survive impacts of climate change better than some of the other species. But we don't know. And some folks are, so I guess I'll go into the next slide in a minute, but real quick, this was 2 years ago, when the herring were, it's hard because fish don't always, you think there's a window of time when they're going to spawn, and you don't know, they don't always spawn when they're supposed to spawn. But we took a field trip, educational field trip out to Cherry Point Gulf Road with Mike McKay from, I believe, Lummi Natural Resources, and because he thought, hey, I think they're going to be spawning. So we went out there looking, and it was hard to find anything, and then somebody found this eelgrass with these eggs clumped to them. So when they spawn, they use either eelgrass or other macroalgae to attach their eggs to, whereas some of the other forage fish spawn a little higher up in the substrate, above, or a little higher in the intertidal zone. And so we found these, and then somebody decided to stick them in a little Tupperware water, and then before we knew it, there were all these little fish popping out of the eggs. That was really cool to watch. So I'm sure a lot of you have already seen this slide elsewhere from the Puget Sound Partnership, but so in the past too, we had Evelyn Brown from Lummi Natural Resources talk about different forage fish and their stocks. And so Cherry Point their herring have been in decline since we started pretty much documenting them. And so it's unknown if so some other species have these up-down cycles, and were they just having a weird, really, that was their heyday, and that was not their norm? Or were they really a robust spawning group, and now they're in decline, and we need to figure out how to fix that? And as I think Lyle was saying earlier, what we've also been discovering is that they aren't quite spawning necessarily still at Cherry Point. They've been slowly moving up north. And I think there's been some discussion over, maybe they're still here, maybe they're spawning a little bit further north. And, herring don't know, just like they don't look at calendars, they don't look at boundaries either. And so if they were, say, spawning just north of the Canadian border, we might be totally missing out that that's just where they've moved. So the, yeah.
I'm just curious about the wastewater outfall
Mhm.
coming from BP and ConocoPhillips and Intalco.
Yeah.
If they're moving further away, maybe there's something in the water that doesn't agree with them and we haven't taken a close enough look at.
Yeah, so there are a bunch of emerging contaminants of concern that we're starting to recognize. We haven't recognized all of them, and so sometimes it's hard to, in terms of what we are currently regulating, as far as I can tell, everyone's in compliance with their National Pollutions Discharge Elimination System permits. If you look at the Mussel Watch program, so the Mussel Watch program sets out cages of mussels. So there's different kinds of sampling. There's the, you go out one time to collect a sample and see what it is right in that moment and hope that that is a representative sample. Or Mussel Watch takes the approach of they set out mussel cages for an extended period of time so that the mussels, the idea is they're filter feeders, so they take in the water and filter it out and will hold on to contaminants over a period of time. And so if there's low levels of something or something only is present every now and then, hopefully the mussels will be able to capture it. And actually, through the Mussel Watch program, it looks like the water is fairly clean. But that's not to say that there might be something else there. If you follow the story with pre-spawn mortality in coho salmon, they're finding that maybe it's something in tire dust that's actually causing the mortality in coho before they're able to spawn. But they're still not quite sure what chemical compound. So we're still discovering there's lots of chemicals out there that we're unaware of that have impacts that we don't know about.
Well, I think back on, what was it, John?
Yeah, in Cardona. Yeah, I was just going to get, yeah.
Coming up with, was it 4 parts per billion?
Yeah, right,
Oil,
right,
it'll kill the
yeah,
smell.
right. Yep. So for those of you who weren't here last year, we had a speaker talk about the embryonic effects of things like PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, from urban runoff. It comes from uncombusted or incomplete combustion of things like fossil fuels. And so he was finding in his research that very low concentrations actually could have significant impacts where it doesn't necessarily kill like the herring or other forage fish. It doesn't quite kill them, but it means that they're less likely to survive beyond that. Some other recent research that's emerging right now, it's something that I think some of us suspected, but they're actually proving it, is that PCBs can transfer maternally from mother forage fish to their eggs. And so now we're finding that potentially we have young forage fish that are born inherently already contaminated with PCBs. It's not that they're getting it later, they're already contaminated, and it's not just a one-time thing, but it's several spawning events. So even the females are still offloading PCBs to their eggs several years into their life cycle, which is concerning. Yes.
Why is the squawks and stock separated out? Is it also late spawning or is there some other reason?
There is a reason for it, and I can't remember it. I'm sorry. If you look on the Puget Sound partnerships, Birdie?
It's another genetically
Yes.
distinct
Okay.
stock.
Yes. Thank you. It's another genetically distinct stock.
In what way? Not late spawning, but something else?
I'm not sure. I just know that it's also a distinct stock like Cherry Point is genetically distinct.
Squawks and that's probably South Sound somewhere.
Yep. Yeah. And so another study that I believe is undergoing is, speaking of genetics, they've been trying to look at the DNA. They've taken a whole bunch of fin clips and other DNA samples from forage fish because they go out into the ocean and then we don't know what happens to them really after that. And so it's really hard to manage these forage fish if you don't know what they're doing other than when they come up to the beach to spawn. So they're trying to better understand that and see, like, are there differences between Cherry Point and the other salmon stocks. And so I think hopefully at a future science forum, maybe we can have a speaker talk to that and what they're finding. But I believe they were finally able to separate out the Cherry Point DNA to a point where they can test for that. It was a tough process because usually, as I was saying, when we encounter and we know that it's actually a Cherry Point herring, it's when they're coming up to spawn. And it's no surprise that there's all kinds of DNA contamination when they're coming in to spawn. So it was hard for scientists to really whittle that out. Another significant species is salmon. Obviously, anyone know where this photo is taken from? Yeah, so this is actually at Gulf Road, so I just included it because I thought, somebody here connected salmon with this area, so I thought that was kind of cool. So obviously salmon aren't actually spawning at Cherry Point. They spawn in freshwater rivers, but they do use the nearshore area. And the habitat along Cherry Point, there's a lot of armored shoreline these days throughout Puget Sound, and so it's really important to have these habitat corridors that juvenile salmon can travel through before they re-enter into the open ocean. Surf smelt are another forage fish species that are important. I believe, does the Puget Sound Corps sample for these at Cherry Point? So you guys go out and you collect the substrate samples and look for eggs, which is cool. Orca are another one that are ever increasingly important throughout the Puget Sound as we're recognizing that their populations, especially the southern resident orca, are in peril. And surf scoters are listed also as another significant species. They're pretty cool birds. I always think of their beaks. They look like some really awkward teenager that didn't quite grow into his nose yet. But they're pretty good at cracking oyster shells like you see here. So some of the important habitats up there are eelgrass beds. And so this actually is the OA setup that I was talking about earlier today. So we were helping Department of Natural Resources this past summer to go out, and you can see the eelgrass is just taking over this area, along with lots of other things, which then end up biofouling the sensors. So we had volunteers going out to clean the sensors and swap out spat tiles. So we had these tiles that we put out there to see if oysters were being recruited. So somebody is back in a lab right now, I'm sure, counting how many little tiny oysters there are on those spat tiles. And we also did some eelgrass density and blade measurements while we were out there too. But eelgrass is important habitat for lots and lots of different species. Some people refer to it sort of as an estuary. So hopefully in a future year, Micah Horowitz, who heads up this project with DNR, has presented here in the past, but with us and other volunteers cleaning those sensors at all of the sites this summer, he says he has a really wonderful data set, better than he's ever had. So I'm excited to see what the data says, and it's from the little that I've seen of the data, it looks like Cherry Point is a little different in terms of our pH and freshwater input compared to some of the other sites, which is interesting. So I guess just real quickly, eelgrass as well as bulk kelp, it's looking like in terms of OA, it might be able to buffer pH at least temporarily during the daytime enough, not a lot, but enough for things like oyster larvae to potentially, to have a better chance of survival. So bull kelp's another one that is considered, or another species, well, it's funny because it's a species, but it's also a habitat for lots of other species. And so this is also taken off of Gulf Road at a monitoring site that we have out there. And it's cool because sometimes when you're out there, you get to see things like great blue heron standing on top of the kelp, searching and hunting for fish, stuff like that. One of the other things that seems like it may be emerging in science, there aren't, as far as I know, any papers out on it, but bull kelp beds and eelgrass beds are considered things that we really want to restore and we want more of because they're so important in terms of habitat. But one of the things that makes them important for habitat is that they slow down wave action and water. So in terms of sediment, fate, and transport and contaminants along with that sediment, it's looking like maybe these areas potentially could be sinks for contaminants too. So one question moving forward is, we need to think about how we, maybe and where we put these eelgrass and kelp beds in, if they might be attractive habitats for animals, but actually death traps if they're super contaminated. I'm not saying we shouldn't put them in, but maybe there's other mechanisms that we can do to minimize the contaminants that then accumulate in them. Lyle?
Is there any data going back decades as far as the quantity of bull kelp?
So the reason why we started monitoring bull kelp is there's very little data, at least in the Puget Sound area. There's a little bit more on the outer coast. And so the Marine Resource Committees and the Northwest Straits Commission started working with DNR on figuring out, like, okay, what's a good protocol? Because at least in the South Sound, people anecdotally started noticing that kelp beds are disappearing. And like, I thought there was a kelp bed there, now it's not there. Wait, was there a kelp bed? Is it shrinking? Am I just imagining this? So we've been trying to look throughout the Puget Sound region to see, what's there, how is it changing, is it changing? And there's lots of different types of kelp beds. This kelp bed in particular, DNR has done other studies on it too, outside of the monitoring that the Whatcom MRC does. But it looks like some years there's almost no kelp there, and other years there's lots and lots of kelp. So we're still better trying to understand that. I think maybe some of that has to do with the substrate on the bottom and wave action. Cherry Point is, like I've said, a unique area. And when you go to the beach and you see like a sandy beach and you see like the wave ripples, you can see that at Cherry Point, but with boulders like larger than, the size that end up happening after large storm events. So it's a really, really interesting area. And lots can change too. Some areas after a big storm just look completely different afterwards, which makes intertidal surveys interesting sometimes too. The mixed macroalgae beds are another important habitat too. And yeah, it's Doug and Marie. Wish I had, there's another photo I think of Bob in the intro once, but Marie, do you know how many different types of algae there are out there?
Well, I read a long list.
Right. There's an extremely long list of macroalgae that are out there. It's yeah, the reds are a lot of fun, and it's kind of cool. And well, maybe not so much in this picture, maybe in the next one, but you can see the reds here and some of the green back there. But algae separate out based on their color because of light and depth and how water or the sunlight can penetrates based on the different chlorophylls that they have. Better take it up. And there's the feeder bluffs, and so this is by Point Whitehorn, and there's the feeder bluffs up here. This goes a little bit back to like the drift cell thing that Bertie was talking about earlier. So these, one of the nice things is that this area has, these feeder bluffs are more or less protected, and some other areas, people want to be right along the edge, and feeder bluffs are meant to erode away and carry sediment down shore with the current and provide more sand and sediment in other places. But when people build up against the edge, it really gets in the way of that beach nourishment. And then, as I mentioned before, the cobble and boulder beaches really stand out to me because, like I said, I haven't seen the huge boulders like that move around as frequently in other locations as they do here. It's really amazing. So, as you've heard me kind of allude to throughout this presentation, we do a variety of citizen science projects out there. This is our intertidal monitoring, and we do several other ones. Bertie brought this up, but one of the things that DNR is working on is making sure that the data is more available to the public and people can know about what we're studying and where we're studying it. Something that we're also working on too with that is things like our intertidal surveys. It sounds like there's about 7 or so other counties out there that are also doing intertidal monitoring, including the Protection Island Aquatic Reserve. They are taking on our intertidal monitoring protocols. We actually helped them start it up this year because we really want to be able to tie together the different things that are going on in Puget Sound. And so Jen later on will be talking about bird surveys. That's another example of it's great to not just it's wonderful to collect data for Cherry Point in particular, but it's also nice to know what's it doing region-wide so that maybe not, this isn't something that we'll see, but with the herring, like I said before, maybe they're spawning further north and we need to work with somebody else who's working further north to see that. And maybe there's other trends with intertidal surveys or with birds or sea star wasting syndrome that we'd be able to get from more of a regional data set. And so one example is with the intertidal data. We're working with Jason Toft from UW on getting, he has the Shoreline monitoring toolbox, but now we're working on a database where we, as well as anyone else who's doing the intertidal monitoring protocol, can enter their data so that we can look at it in a more holistic way. And we can also make sure that it's a great time to make sure that our protocol is all compatible and we don't get 10 years into it and go, oh my gosh, we can't compare our data, or it's really hard or difficult. We want to make sure we're comparing apples with apples, not apples with oranges. So I think Bertie mentioned some of the studies here, some of the other ones, or I think I mentioned most of these, and there's certainly more than that going on. I think the storm surge stuff will be interesting. It looks like maybe countywide there's, over the next 5 years or so, USGS is going to develop some better models on storm surges and circulation studies that all tie into climate change impacts and how that's changing our shorelines. And with that, there's also a MyCoast app that's going to extend to our area where you're able to download an app and then can enter everything into that so that we can then better document those changes. So I'm almost through. I, as the North Sound Baykeeper, feel like it's really important to make sure that science and management and policy are all intertied and don't sit separate. So some of the things that are coming up, there's the Shoreline Master Programs update. The periodic updates are starting in 2019, which will be here before you know it. They're based, they're local land use policies and regulations that guide the use of our state's shorelines, and they're meant to protect natural resources and provide public access and plan for water-dependent uses. And so there's a county one, and then there's, City of Bellingham has one, Ferndale has one, et cetera, et cetera. So that's going to be coming out soon. And I guess as a quick little side note, does anybody know what this is? This is at Cherry Point. And this is just an example of one of the cool things that's out there. So there's this, actually, that last photo with Marie and Doug out there we're looking at a -3 or so tide, and we came across this clam, and Doug and I went, what is that? That is an ugly clam. And then our bivalve expert comes over and she's like, oh yeah, that's an ugly clam. We're like, no, but what is it really? She's like, no, it's the Pacific Northwest ugly clam. So it's like this awful, like bright orangey kind of puke orange color inside. There's a lot of cool stuff out there. So having management plans that can protect these cool things that you never even knew existed out there, I think is pretty special. Yeah, I think I can't remember. It was about 2 or 3 years ago, but yeah, I think it was attached to that rock. The other thing that's coming is the Cherry Aquatic Reserve management plan is going to be updated in 2020, which again will be here before you know it. And it's a big plan, and some of the other aquatic reserves are already going through the process. So there will be some room for stakeholder involvement, but I want to have you guys all think, because you guys could participate in this, what have we learned since 2010 when the last management plan was there, and we're hoping to figure out better ways to use our citizen science data to better inform management plans moving forward. So here are some of the things you can do. You can look out for when those updates are coming. If you're on either of the email lists outside, you'll probably get an email from us about one of those. Also, you can participate on the Citizen Stewardship Committee. They meet the first Wednesday of every month at Resources in the main room from 3 to 5 p.m. And sometimes they have exciting speakers that come too, so you can learn even more than you would learn today. And I also encourage you to participate in citizen science projects too. It's a great way to get out there, get to know the area, help collect data, help resource agencies like DNR fill data gaps, and you also get to learn and be out there, which is pretty cool too, and be a part of it. So that's all I have, and yeah.
I have a question about that image.
This one.
Is that
Yeah.
a native fish trap?
We never figured that out. So this photo is from Cherry Point as well. It is a semi-secret location from what I understand.
That's the location.
'Cause- Yes, yeah. So this is kind of on the southern end of, but not quite, like southern third, I think, of Cherry Point. And this is at an extreme low tide. And there's speculation that this might have been a fish weir or a clam garden or something like that. We haven't been able to quite figure out exactly what it is, but it's kind of a cool reminder of maybe some of the history that went on there that we're not even aware of.
Eleanor, I really appreciated your history.
Oh, yeah.
Where exactly was the fish camp in Cherry Point Beach?
That's a great question. Do you know, Kim? I have.
Dug that up? Have you found that?
So the question is, where was the fish camp at Cherry Point? I'm not entirely sure. I have some ideas, but I'm not entirely sure. My guess is it would have been somewhere around Gulf Road, because the whole Point Whitehorn area is up on the feeder bluffs, and I don't imagine the fishing camp having to climb up.
Or was it Cherry Point itself, which is on the nautical chart?
Right.
And there is a midden there, there's an old midden.
Ah, neat. I'm not sure. So something Kim and I were talking about for a future talk is having someone dig into the history of Cherry Point and really do a deep dive on that, because I think it's really interesting. I think, we talk about how to manage it, and we don't always know the full history of the site. Yeah. Yeah. Bob?
You might be able to get some information from that semi-amu museum.
Oh,
Was it
okay.
the Packers Museum, I think they call it.
Okay.
It could be something
Great.
available there on the history of Cherry Point.
Great. Yeah.
Do you get any comparison between our side, do you get any comparison of our side of the water with the Canadian side? Since, the islands are just across from us.
Right.
So are they doing the same sort of thing, or do they have any information that you can compare with our information?
I've seen more and more efforts in the last few years to facilitate that. I don't think we're at a point where we're having regular conversations, and in some cases, yes. I think with the creation of the Salish Sea Institute, they're trying to facilitate that more, and they're hoping that people will come to them to figure out, like, is anybody else studying this, or like, hey, what's going on the other side? Who would I go to, or who would I approach to ask? It's tough because their policy and management looks different on the other side of the border, and so some of the things that seems important to them is different than what we see as important and what can get funding and not get funding. But I think that's really important that we're reaching across the border and talking to our partners, because, our critters don't know where the boundaries are. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Did you get your...